Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is titled The Future of eCOA, a panel discussion. My name is Nima and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for online streaming. You'll be receiving a link to the recording of this webinar via email in a few business days following this event. You can also access all recordings you've registered for under your My Profile section of xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Y-Prime, who developed the content for this presentation. Y-Prime offers more than a decade of focused work with eClinical systems to expedite and improve the quality of patient management, clinical supplies, drug accountability, and clinical data. Cloud-based interactive response technology and electronic clinical outcome assessment platforms offer sponsors greater speed, precision, and integration in clinical trial management. Now, I'd like to introduce our webinar moderator, who will be facilitating the panel discussion and the Q&A session for today's event. Lisa Henderson is the Editorial Director for Applied Clinical Trials and Pharmaceutical Executive. She has over 20 years of experience in business-to-business publishing, covering a variety of industries including clinical trials, managed healthcare, and information technology. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Lisa, who will be introducing the rest of our expert panel. Lisa, you can start the presentation whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you, Nima. I really appreciate it. So let me get back to the correct slide. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before we get to the introductions, I just wanted to explain a bit about our format today. We wanted to have more of an interactive discussion, which is why we're calling it a panel, but we do realize you're used to, the way the format is, you're used to watching a slideshow that goes along. So you will see slides, but the slides on the screen aren't, they're related to our talking points, but they don't necessarily support or not support what we are discussing. It's just a visual for you to look to. So now I want to introduce our panelists. So Ken Grice is the eCOA strategist at Bayer, and he currently oversees strategy, implementation, and operational aspects of eCOA. So Ken, would you like to add some more information around your role?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so I've been in a variety of roles related basically to different types of electronic data capture for my 20 years of career at Bayer. And about 10 years ago, I took over responsibility for our ePro business. And that was based on our expectation that we were going to see a significant growth in ways of collecting data directly from patients. So my role is actually, so it's part strategist, it's part an evangelist for electronic collection, and part operational oversight of eCOA studies. And as we've gotten experience from our ePro business, I'm also interested now to apply the lessons and the methodologies that we've developed to new ways of collecting data from patients. So looking at ways we can do that in the form of wearables and sensors.
Excellent, thank you, Ken. And our next panelist, sorry, I'm even used to the old format, is Jonathan Helfgott, and he's currently the Executive Director of Global Regulatory Clinical Affairs and Market Access at Stage 2 Innovations, and a faculty coordinator for the Regulatory Science and Food Safety graduate programs at Johns Hopkins University. So Jonathan, would you like to add some eCOA color around your role?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa, for the kind introduction. And I spent about 10 years at the FDA, both at the Center for Devices as well as the Center for Drugs, most recently as the Associate Director for Risk Science at the Office of Scientific Investigations, where I served as the agency's Part 11 subject matter expert, conducted inspections, and trained other investigators. And of course, eCOA ePro is a critical aspect of clinical trials, collecting data directly from the patients, oftentimes serving as the primary endpoint of various studies, and the agency is certainly becoming more patient-centric to couple data, as we say, both soft and hard endpoints, understanding how does the patient feel, how are they responding to the treatment, beyond just, what are the lab data, what are some of the, the more quantitative types of measurements, but really focusing on the qualitative aspects. And of course, the people, processes, and the technologies are all essential, and certainly from an FDA perspective, that's critical, and it's from this perspective that I'm going to be drawing upon most of my comments.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. And Donna Mangiello, excuse me, let me switch that. Donna Mangiello, RN, BSN, is the Vice President of Strategic Solutions for Y-Prime and is a recognized expert in patient recruitment, retention, and eCOA topics. So Donna, would you like to comment on your experience?
Absolutely, thanks, Lisa. I guess I'll keep it short, but I've been a nurse for about 30 years, and I think because of my nursing background, in the last 20 years of supporting e-clinical and digital health solutions, my focus has really been at putting patients at the center. So looking at how a technology solution can improve the patient's experience, how it could potentially reduce the burden of study participation. I think we ask a lot of patients when they come into clinical trials, how can we make it easier for them? And even more so, how can we actually add value to their experience by using clinical technologies? And from that perspective, I'll be sharing my comments today.
Excellent, thanks, Donna. So we're going to set the stage right now by figuring out where most of the audience is in regard to implementing eCOA or COA. So audience, we have a poll right now, and if you could choose one of the most important criteria for when you're including a eCOA or PRO component to your trial. What are the most important decision criteria for implementation? And again, you just choose one and hit submit. Decisions are based on company mandates. Decisions are based on therapeutic areas. Decisions are based on cost. They are based on data utility, or they are based on the population. So again, just choose one and hit submit. And then again, the question, when including a COA or PRO component to your trial, what are the most important decision criteria for implementation? Based on company mandates, they are based on therapeutic areas, decisions are based on cost, decisions are based on data utility, or they are based on the population. And when we're ready, Nima will give us a roundup of those results.
All right, Lisa, it looks like most of the audience members have voted. Let's take a look at these results. All right, so 9% of audience members have selected the first option. Decisions are based on company mandates. 24% of audience members have selected decisions are based on therapeutic areas. 17% of audience members have selected decisions are based on cost. 41%, the majority of audience members, have selected decisions are based on data utility, and 9% of audience members have selected decisions are based on population. Now back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Nima. So panelists, we have the majority is data utility is the most important criteria, followed by the therapeutic area, and then cost comes in third. So Ken, do you have any thoughts around those decision criteria?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's encouraging. I mean, I think we often see cost is given as a reason for not doing electronic, but I think the data utility is really an important driver. So that would have been the one that I would have chosen. We discussed in preparation. I probably would have, if I had the option, I would have chosen all of them. But I think data utility is really important. So I mean, it's something we have all the time. We have discussion about modality, and we're still using paper in some cases. But I think what we're trying to do is make key strategic decisions, and we have several therapeutic areas where we're doing more home-based diaries and questionnaires. It is for endpoint data, and it's a significant amount of data that we're collecting, and there the decision's pretty easy, and we definitely have have good traction for ePro. But there are other cases and in other therapeutic areas where we're maybe collecting. I always use the example of if we have an EQ5D that we're only collecting at screening and end of treatment, and that's the only assessment that really we have, then paper often is still going to be the option that we choose. And I think, you know, overall, our organization appreciates and understands the benefit of electronic collection. That's, again, something that I spend a lot of time trying to reinforce with our teams. But again, if it's not a primary endpoint and it's administered at the clinic and it's a minimal amount of data, there are times that we revert to paper. And I think, you know, one of the things, again, strategically we want to look to is that we expect that we're seeing more and more assessments and you know, looking to get data directly from patients. So while we have systems that we're building to collect other assessments, then things like the EQ5D are easy add-ons. So, you know, that's something, you know, we continue to struggle with. I think, you know, we will move to more and more electronic adoption, and certainly we see that in therapeutic areas and in instances where the usage of the data is really driving that.
So is the paper less expensive than the electronic? I mean, in this survey, they picked cost of 17%, but okay.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's a great question. I think, you know, you can do a significant amount of discussion around what are actual costs and what's the return on investment on electronic collection. I think, you know, it is important. I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that paper is not free. And I think that it's often that you know, in terms of if you're working with CROs and other organizations, there's a line item within the budget that ePro stands out. But there are certainly all the costs around paper collection and data entry and how you set up the databases, and not to mention there's a lot of return on investment in the data quality that you get in electronic collection and the ability to monitor that in real time. Again, that's something, you know, if it's for safety reasons or even for operational reasons where you need that data quickly, then electronic also will go forward. So the cost is difficult. Again, you know, if it's a minimal amount of data and it's not the site, I think there are times that paper is still cheaper, but it's a tricky thing. And I think, you know, I've seen different models of trying to really model that, and within each organization, I think you have to look at what your costs for paper truly are.
Thank you. So Jonathan, first, the results with the data utility being the most important criteria for the decision, followed by the therapeutic indication, and then cost. How do you feel about that? I mean, how do you view that?
Sure. I think I'd like to echo Ken's comments. You know, starting with the responses, in many ways, the therapeutic area and the data utility are intertwined. You're only going to be able to use the data itself within certain contexts. You know, pain studies, asthma studies. Again, there's only certain types of effects that can be measured via patient-reported outcomes. And likewise, for those studies where you are looking at, you know, some more quantitative types of endpoints, although the PRO data might be helpful, it may not, you know, it may only be used as an exploratory endpoint itself. With respect to cost, I think there's a few different ways to slice it. I guess the first question is cost to whom? If you look at the budget of a study in its totality, it can also oftentimes be very misleading about who's assigning costs to what, right? You take away from one part, but you might add to another. For example, one of the biggest costs that might not necessarily go out as a line item when you're utilizing paper-based source records is monitoring. Your costs of monitoring go up significantly. We know this oftentimes accounts for a large majority of those study costs. You know, first of all, it takes a lot of time, and there's you know, travel expenses and things of that nature. And then there's also something what we had called at FDA this principle of the cost of non-compliance, which is it's more worthwhile making an investment up front to enhance the quality of your data to prevent issues on the back end. And I think when e-clinical systems, whether it's eCOA, ePROs, EDC systems, etc., when they are utilized effectively and folks are trained at the sites how to use them, I think it's overwhelming amount of evidence to support the fact that it's far superior data quality when that compared to paper. First of all, data collected on paper ultimately ends up into electronic format anyway on the back end. So why not just remove that step and utilize technology to collect data directly? And of course, as one of the authors of the FDA's eSource guidance, one of the core messages was to communicate to industry that FDA would in fact accept data that was collected directly from computerized systems, provided that they had the appropriate controls in place, such as audit trails and access controls. And I think, in general, it's very apparent that if we don't leverage the benefits and the conveniences of technology, us in an industry are really going to be behind the curve. And so I think, reflecting back on the responses of the audience regarding utility, therapeutic area, cost, these are all extremely significant, and I think really not just the regulators, but those at the sites, the patients themselves, and us as an industry are also embracing this trend as well.
Yeah. So Donna, from a technology standpoint, would you ever advocate for paper? I mean,
No, I don't think I would ever advocate for paper. And I think listening to both Ken and Jonathan's comments, we heard a lot about the inability to really, on the sponsor side, see a specific line item cost for paper. It's just embedded. The cost to collect paper data is embedded into systems and processes. And the challenge, I think, for study teams is that they actually have to, as Ken stated, they see a line item for ePro or eCOA. But I liked what Jonathan said about the cost of noncompliance and what Ken said about the ROI of collecting the data electronically. And so I think what I find is that I'm more in the position to educate my clients about the risks of using paper for certain types of data collection. So I think the response of 20 or 41%, I guess, felt that the way the data would be utilized in the trial was the most important criteria. It really lines up with what my expectations would have been from this audience, that they would say, how are we going to be using this data? How is it supporting our endpoint model? And that's the position that I like to come from in advocating for my clients, so that I'm giving them the best advice, or that we at Y Prime are giving them the best advice as to protecting themselves and ensuring that not only are they going to get all of the magnificent data quality of collecting electronically in the first place, but that they're ensuring that because the endpoints are primary or secondary for endpoint for labeling claims, that they're doing it the way that regulators would prefer to see that data. So yeah, I would never particularly advocate for paper. I get, like Ken said, I get how there are certain instances where a sponsor would say, hey, it's low-hanging fruit. We're collecting, this QOL at the front and the back, and it's not supporting any of our critical endpoints. I get why they would make that choice, but I would not particularly advocate for that myself.
Okay. Right. So there are a lot of different technologies for eCOA and ePro, and there's, of course, different reasons for choosing those, which we kind of discussed. But before we get a little bit deeper, we wanted to get the audience thoughts on BYOD, or bring your own device. So I'm going to switch over to that poll question. So the first question we'd like to ask you is, have you considered implementing BYOD as part of your eCOA strategy? And your choices are yes or no. We're going to ask you that, and then give you a couple minutes, not minutes, this shouldn't take too long. Have you considered implementing BYOD? Yes or no, and hit submit.
All right, it looks like most of the audience members have selected their answers. Let's take a look at those results. Okay, so 76% of audience members have selected yes, and 24% of audience members have selected no.
Thanks, Nima. So then we're going to jump right into the next poll. So before we asked you if you considered implementing it, so now we want to know, have you implemented BYOD? So again, bring your own device. Yes or no, you have implemented. And
All right, perfect.
Okay. Nima, those results are in?
Yep, so it looks like most audience members have selected their results. Let's take a look at them. Okay, so 16% of audience members have selected yes, and 84% of audience members have selected no. Now back to you, Lisa.
Thanks. So that's interesting. So this is kind of what we were discussing, right, guys, when we wanted to have this poll, was ask them if they are considering it and then who has actually implemented it. So I guess I'll go to Ken first. What would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's in line with us too. And right, it's considering is obviously a lot easier than implementing. But and from my experience, we were almost there. But yeah, no, we haven't actually implemented yet. So yeah, that does make sense. And you know, I think we'll get there, but there's a number of different things that I think we need to take into account. So I mean, there's equivalency from a scientific perspective. There are privacy issues, but there's also, you know, looking at how are we going to support patients when they can come to the study with any number of brought your own devices. And I think we're also going to be faced with the fact that you know, when we do a BYOD study, we're still going to have to provision devices for a certain percentage of patients in the trial. So some of the headaches that we're trying to get rid of, we're not going to be able to completely avoid. But still, I am an advocate for BYOD, and I think we'll get there.
And we will be talking more about that. Does anyone else want to comment on the results that we had, Jonathan or Donna?
Well, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I think I'm in line with Ken that this is completely expected. I'm not at all surprised that this is something that's on everybody's radar, but that not many have actually gone forward to implement. It's actually what we're seeing in our own customer base. I think we're seeing a lot of our customers come to us with questions about this, but also with a fairly lengthy list of concerns about this. And while we have implemented a number of BYOD studies, in fact, one of which was recently submitted and approved, which is exciting for BYOD for everybody to see that that's actually happened. It's still something that I think we're going to see, you know, greater adoption, you know, in the coming year to couple of years as technology continues to advance and the acceptability of this increases.
Jonathan?
Yeah, and I would add that likewise, it's not necessarily surprising because of the conservative nature of our industry. However, I think common sense would tell you BYOD is better than provision devices for multiple different reasons. Elements of convenience, even patient compliance. They're clearly going to be more likely, you know, to use their own phone or their own tablet, whatever the case is, than they would be lugging around, you know, another device itself. Whether using, depending on the platform, they might be more familiar with the Android or the iPhone or vice versa. And I think even cultural validation considerations are very important. Translating into different languages, you know, Ken brought up the idea of, you know, psychometric validation, making sure that you're comparing apples to apples. That could clearly be a challenge when you're looking towards BYOD, to making sure that across the different modalities, you're collecting uniform data. But I think notwithstanding all of those challenges, you know, really arguments can be made, especially from a technology and a user interface perspective, that that BYOD is better. I also expect this trend to change. I think the more approvals we hear about, like Donna was explaining, where BYOD was utilized, the quicker that's going to happen. But certainly from an FDA perspective, BYOD is acceptable, again, provided the right controls are in place, the right testing and validation was done. And so I expect if we had the same webinar and had the same poll, a year from now, and 2 years and 3 years from now, there's no doubt in my mind that the trend will continue to increase. But as Ken mentioned, considering is one thing, implementing is another. So hopefully we'll get this sooner rather than later.
Right. So that's a good segue into for Donna's question I have for you about cloud technology. So and you just talked about your successes, how does BYOD fit in the cloud?
Yeah, that's a good question. So cloud technology in and of itself just offers, I think, a lot of flexibility to eCOA. And so in just thinking in terms of eCOA across the board, independent of BYOD, with the cloud, we can offer things like data syncing across devices. So at the site, you have a tablet. If you have more than one tablet, you don't have to restrict your patient population to only using the tablet that they were originally set up on. That's really fabulous because in a non-cloud-based eCOA environment, when a tablet fails in some way, a patient breaks it, drops it, whatever, there are large challenges in trying to manage all of those patients that were on that tablet on the other tablet. In fact, typically it's not done. So that's a challenge that I think cloud-based eCOA really does help to remove. Additionally, with the cloud, you can build a one-size-fits-all library. So if you build the instrument once, it will scale automatically to any modality, whether that's a patient's handheld device that they own or provisioned one, a tablet, the web, in any of those modalities. So that is a great savings in time and cost. You don't have to recreate an instrument when it's built in a cloud-based environment. So those are just sort of how the cloud benefits eCOA. And in regards to BYOD, as we already said, this is something that's been on everyone's radar for some time. Our Y-Prime's cloud-based eCOA solution was actually designed in support of BYOD. I mentioned things like dynamic scaling of the instrument so that independent of if you have the largest screen iPhone or Android or the smallest screen, it's going to look exactly the same so that the patient's experience is virtually identical across devices. And Ken mentioned that the concept of hybrid. Frankly, we're not at a place typically where a sponsor is going to be willing to say, all right, in order to qualify for this trial, you must own a device, an Android or iPhone device with the following screen size and operating system. We're not going to exclude otherwise qualified patients from study participation because they don't own a device. So we're always going to be in a position, at least in this day, where we're going to be doing that sort of hybrid solution where we're provisioning a certain number of devices to patients so that we can get everybody. And then I think there's something else that's going on that we've certainly been hearing about, and that has to do with patients actually not wanting to use their own device. It's been more than 5 years, I think, that we've been talking about BYOD and being excited for the promise of BYOD, simplifying device costs, removing shipping costs and logistics. Patients are familiar with their own devices, so it's easier for them. They don't have to learn a device. But in reality, patients have concerns today that they didn't have 5 years ago, or as much anyway, in regards to their own privacy and having a third party have access to their phone and any data that's on their phone through an app. And so I think that those are concerns that we are hearing about, where patients are saying, yeah, well, no, I don't want to use my own phone. Years ago it was, geez, is it burdensome to ask the patient to carry their own phone plus a provisioned phone? Now it's the patient saying, no, maybe I'd rather have a separate device and keep that part of my business, my life, outside of my personal device. So there's a lot of things I think that are in consideration in regards to BYOD. Yeah.
Thanks, Donna. So, Ken, you had said you are an advocate of BYOD. Do you have anything to add to what Donna was saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pieces that both Donna and Jonathan picked up from some of my comments are things around compliance, and I think that's one of the pieces that we were trying to really drive towards is that the expectation that if a patient can use their own phone that's in their pocket or in their handbag all the time, that they're more likely to have higher compliance. So we're certainly seeing that. I think some of the pieces of looking at privacy and some hesitancy there is an interesting piece. The other part, though, is I think we talk about bring your own device and the expectation that the patient is using their own phone. But looking at the hybrid model, I think one of the other pieces is we get away from having to provision a single model of device. That gives us a lot more flexibility where you can collect the data from patients on their own phones, but from a sponsor side and some of the logistics challenges too around purchasing a significant inventory so that we can support a study over a long period of time. If you're able to even provision different devices throughout the life cycle of a trial, that gives us some more flexibility, which starts to remove some of the burden that we see for doing a completely provisioned trial.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Lisa, I'll just add one thing because I think Ken, you just brought up a really, really important idea, and that is that, sponsors are acquiring inventories of devices, which then, if you don't have enough of that inventory in the current provisioned environment, devices go end of life, so you can't purchase new of that inventory, and it kind of becomes a burden to the sponsor to own devices that they can't repurpose. And so I think with cloud-based and BYOD and the continued acceptance of these things, that you can do exactly what you just said, and you can mix your own inventory and not worry about the fact that someone is using a Motorola phone versus someone's using an HTC or some other Android model, because the concept is the cloud is displaying it identically for every single patient. So if it works for BYOD,
Yep.
It can work for a mixed provision mode as well. So that's a really good point.
Yep.
Great, thank you. So Jonathan, we should discuss the FDA and EMA because regulatory is always of utmost importance to the sponsors in regard to the validity of data they collect. So in your experience, does BYOD cause an issue for regulators?
Interesting question. Let's start sort of with the global nature of clinical studies, recognizing the GDPR over in Europe and the issues of data privacy. That's becoming increasingly important because we know about 3/4 of every clinical study, every NDA includes data from sites outside the United States that FDA review. So it's not really just a U.S. domestic issue. I think we have to take into consideration the international implications. That being said, even the definition of cloud computing can also be very broad. Are we talking about virtualization? Are we simply talking about data storage? Are we talking about public clouds, private clouds? There's so many different ways to slice and dice it. I was on the FDA Cloud Computing Working Group, and we spent so many years spinning our wheels because we really didn't know what issue to tackle first, and that also included FDA internally storing data on cloud, right? There's a legislation called Cloud First that all federal agencies must justify if they don't already use cloud computing, why they're not going to use cloud computing. So again, a lot of different ramifications there. Let's go back to a comment that Donna had made, and I guess I would challenge the notion that patients would prefer having a separate device. Of course, I guess, according to the 80-20 rule, you're always going to have outliers. And, just like there's folks that want to have a separate phone for their work purposes and for their personal purposes, it's quite common. I wouldn't say, though, that that's necessarily a majority, and we have to decide, as a sponsor, do we allow this hybrid model? Do we allow, for those that prefer to have provision phones, do we give them that? Or do we give them BYOD, or do we force them to use whatever we provide? And of course, there's always trade-offs there. It becomes a little more complex if you're dealing simultaneously with not just BYOD across different types of platforms, but then with the provision devices, and then add on to it different languages, as I discussed earlier. And so it can become quite complex. And I think there might be some value in just simplifying, what it is that we're trying to do. Right? We're trying to collect quality data from patients. How can we best do that? So sprinkle in the topic of cloud. Sure, it could become more economical as long as we address the data privacy considerations, but I think we have to know who our population is. I think perhaps an elderly population might be indeed more inclined, as Donna said, to prefer to have a separate provision device. They might not even necessarily have their own smartphones. But I think as you go into sort of other types or more diverse types of patient populations, you're going to hear different things. And I don't think there's a magic bullet or a single answer that we can provide.
Thanks, Jonathan. So are there any trends that you see that can lead into more BYOD in this eCOA piece? The transitions into away from just brick and mortar sites, for example. There's more virtual trials and that kind of thing. Can you hear me?
Hi, Lisa. It seems that your computer has timed out on your end, so I took back control. Would you like me to send it back?
Can you hear me? Is the audience on?
So we can hear you, Lisa. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. So I was asking Jonathan about other influences, the future trends of, or increasing trends in the area of moving away from investigative site models and having patients located more virtually. Does that affect the BYOD model and eCOA?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I was involved when I was at the agency in the Detrol trial, and we're still here today talking about the Detrol trial. And so, we do have a tendency to move at a glacial pace. That being said, I expect it to come in phases. And I think instead of, going from one extreme to another, exclusive brick and mortar to just complete virtual, I think there's going to be, for example, certain, let's say, visits that instead of requiring the patient to come into the site, it might be able to be done remotely. And this is also integrating aspects of telemedicine and, of course, ePro, eCOA. So yes, I think that's going to significantly impact the ability to appeal to the patient more. That's also one of the biggest challenges, is recruitment. I think if it's a very demanding protocol, the likelihood of not just getting patients in there, but sticking to it and following the requirements in the study can be difficult. And so the more we're able to cater to things like, no, you can be, driving in your car and having, a response or a discussion with someone at the site, or completing information, or you could still be on vacation for an extended period of time and actively participating in the trial. And clearly these kinds of tools are going to play a pivotal role in supporting that. And I think everyone stands to benefit, not just the patient, the sponsor. I think costs, an argument can be made that they would be significantly reduced. I think you also have to take into consideration how this might impact, let's say, an inspection. Do we have appropriate document control around capturing results from these visits? That might be virtual in nature. And then on the other extreme, there are cases where it might, in fact, be plausible to do a study completely virtually, right? You recruit online, you send them, let's say, kits in the mail, you still have someone from the site or the sponsor or the CRO that's going to engage with the patient, make sure they understand what their expectations are. And so I really do believe strongly that ePro and eCOA will be one of the critical factors in supporting a more widespread adoption of these virtual models, whether it's in a hybrid model or a true virtual clinical trial itself.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I wanted to jump in. I'm going to address the slide now just because I thought this was interesting when IQVIA presented this, but I hope you can all read it. But in 2018, this report is new active substances launched for the first time in the U.S. 18 of those included pro data on the label. So I wondered if anyone is seeing trends toward collecting more patient and clinician data in trials, and if so, what are they asking for, why, at what phase? And so Ken, I thought I'd ask you first for your comments from the sponsor side.
Yeah, I mean, and I think in the context of what you're showing here, I think certainly across the industry, we're seeing the trend where we want to get more information directly from the patient, right? And what is their experience, and it helps us on the sponsor side also differentiate our product. So I think it's an important trend and something that we're seeing. There are all sorts of ways I think that you do that. So if we're baking in where there are endpoints that are pro-based, like what you're seeing in the slide that you have up, but it is also, I mean, again, we see some of the stuff is even just from a payer perspective and from reimbursement, if you can differentiate the product. So even if it's not for efficacy claims or a label claim, it's still about differentiating the product, and I think we see more and more of that. And I guess going to Jonathan's point about some of the stuff around virtual trials, there's a balance too here that we're going to have to address, is that we can start to collect more and more data from patients through wearables, through sensors, and it has some of the benefits that Jonathan has outlined, that you're potentially reducing the burden for sites and for patients to have to come in for clinic visits. But it is also, I mean, now we're relying on the patient to be able to deliver on those things. So, and some of the things, again, around support for whether it's in a traditional ePro trial for BYOD for their phone, but also managing the devices and things like that. But I think, that's the interesting piece. I think, what we've started to develop from ePro, I mean, I've always said, if you look at EDC as kind of the scope of the data that we're collecting, it's all kind of at the site, and ePro was one of the first places where we started to really engage the patient and make them part of that. I think it's really exciting, but it brings a lot of the challenges that we start to see. Is the support is really scopes at a completely different level when you've got lots of patients in the trial. But yeah, we're definitely again around putting in additional endpoints that are PRO based, looking at additional endpoint data that we may be able to get, and or using things as a proxy for what we would normally collect at a clinic visit.
Excellent, thank you. So as we're collecting all this data, I want to jump into the question about, are we collecting too much eCOA and ePro data, and will it or can it lead to more complex trials or burdens? Ken, I'm going to go to you, Ken, first.
Yeah, again, I think that's part of what I was saying about trying to create a balance. Yeah, again, if you don't have to come into the site for a clinic visit because you are wearing a sensor, we can get vitals information independently. Is it more or lesser burden? I guess you would have different perceptions, right? But I think it shifts it. So the other thing, one of the other pieces that I really like about when we do ePro collections, that it also allows us to really benchmark what is the burden. In a lot of cases, if we're doing things on paper, I mean, you can have a sense of how long things are taking to complete and things like that. But with electronic collection, you actually have a lot of the metadata around those pieces as well. So I definitely think it's a shifting of burden, something that you have to be aware of. But I think there's a lot of opportunity really for us to make it easier for all the stakeholders in the clinical trial.
And Jonathan, do you have any comments around collecting too much data?
Yeah, I really believe in a philosophy of less is more, but there are some caveats. What we're actually finding is is, Ken mentioned some of the wearables. They're oftentimes used for exploratory analysis, but you end up finding the most interesting things from that data, sometimes even more significant, if you will, than the primary endpoint. Of course, that's not necessarily what you want to hear as a sponsor, but at a worst case scenario, it can be almost like an insurance plan. That being said, it's very important to, at the study design level, to really have a laser focus on what is it that you're trying to do. Are you trying to get FDA or other approval? Are you also simultaneously trying to support, payer coverage, private, public, etc.? So all these things are going to dictate how much or how little data you should be gathering. And traditionally, the academic research institutions, the NIH type of studies, they have a little bit of a different approach. They kind of go for the broad scope of data collection, whereas sponsors with limited budgets want to really carefully prioritize what's most essential for the study. So striking that right balance between not collecting too little but also not collecting too much, in many ways, is just as much of an art as it is a science. That's why not just ePro, not just eClinical, but the whole study design aspect needs to be a team effort. We need to make sure that we're involving all different departments, multiple different disciplines, if we're going to do this the right way. And then I think that will give you the best chance of making the right decisions about how much or how little data to collect for your particular study needs.
Thank you. And Donna, do you have any thoughts about collecting too much data? Is it a burden?
Yeah, I think that I'm pretty much lined up with both Jonathan and Ken on this, that balance is key. And my view being from the patient and even site's perspective is to basically just look at the need for the data and the risk of the overburdening of the data collection. We haven't really talked much about the site. I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but we have to remember the site's part of this as well, and the amount of questionnaires that are administered at a site visit and how that backs up their patients in their waiting room. But I think eCOA design can also be a factor here. So you can have few instruments with poor design, that's going to be burdensome, versus more instruments with good design, which can actually remove or reduce burden. So that's a feature that always needs to be in consideration. I'd also say that, from Jonathan's earlier comments about virtual trials, it's like one of my sweet spots that I really look forward to that future evolving, where we're in a position that patients are managing most of this in their day-to-day lives, and we have nurses going to patients' home to collect lab values and monitor parameters, and patients are doing most things from some level of technology. I think that that's a place where the burden is really minimized to the most. So I think burden is something that we always have to be concerned about, and balancing the need for the data against the burden on the patient and the site is very critical.
So I'm going to say, we are living in a virtual world, everyone, and we're all virtually located, and we've all have some virtual background noise. But I like the dog; he's cute. So I just wanted to touch on. We did discuss this, and Ken brought it up. We started with EDC and collecting all the data, and then ePro and Pro is probably the first time you start asking the patient for their point of view. And Jonathan touched on retention using BYOD and other tools on the phones to alert, and text messaging to keep the patients engaged and retained. So I want to ask you, do you think that ePro is a tool for patient engagement? Ken?
So I think fundamentally it is. I mean, there's two parts to this answer. I think as we have involved the patient, and you're expecting that there's, in a lot of cases where we're running this, that there's daily interaction with the device and with the data that they're sending to us, it is part of the engagement with the trial. So you have this continuous engagement. It's something that as a sponsor you can monitor. If you're seeing that there's low compliance, you can intervene. So I think it sets up that whole kind of dynamic of increased patient engagement and the ability for sites and sponsors to be involved in that as well. But then there's solutions where I think there's much more sophisticated patient engagement, where it's truly that is your aim with developing the system is, again, like you mentioned, potentially messaging to the patient, giving them information about what to expect in upcoming visits, information about the trial, potentially feeding back information about their own data and what you see, or the patient population or the trial status as a whole. So I think that is also an exciting piece. But I think even, again, just fundamentally having the interaction with the device and with the data and filling out the assessments is in itself a form of patient engagement.
Makes sense. And Donna, do you want to add to this?
Absolutely, and sorry about the dogs. I think they're out now. Yeah, these are the pitfalls of working from home. Sorry to all attendees on the call. I think engagement, again, it really ties right back into one of my key areas of interest, and that is how do we make it better? How do we use technology to support the patient, reduce their burden, and in fact add value? And I think eCOA solutions are a great place to do that. It absolutely needs to be done thoughtfully and in the mind of easing burden and simplifying participation. So I think that is a critical aspect of adding intentional engagement into eCOA rather than what Ken described as sort of the passive way that eCOA does engage. We should use the technology, make it work a little bit harder, offer more value. We can do things like visit reminders that include frequently asked questions so patients know, what do I bring to the visit? What procedures are going to be done? So helping to manage their expectations about visits. How long will the visit take? And then I think we can do things like add in gamification, and gamification isn't just for kids. I mean, we think of it, I think, in the eCOA world as, oh, well, we're going to build in, animation, or we're going to build in, characters and give them features to do things. That's great for kids and probably really important. But I mean, in my day-to-day life, the apps that I use have gamification principles built in, where you make a review and you get badges, and silly little things like that are self-esteem builders for all of us. Who doesn't like to be recognized, even if it's by an app, for doing something? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I don't think that we're probably using it the way that it can be, and I look forward to the opportunity to continue to sort of enhance the patient's experience with eCOA engagement being added more and more.
Thanks, Donna. So I know we're running out of time, and we have two big topics we still want to discuss. So we want to talk about wearables. So we'll start with that, and then site burden if we get to that. So let's start with the wearables discussion. So Ken, I know that you're a big advocate of wearables. So can you elaborate on that?
Well, I certainly think that's going to be an area that we move into. So again, it's pieces that enable things which are either full virtual or partial virtual trials. And again, I think we start to see where there's the potential to collect a lot of very interesting information, even in passive ways, from specific sensors and wearables that are meant to do that, or even around devices. I mean, the phones and things like that also have data that we could potentially be using for other information that's clinically relevant. And again, I think, in terms of eSource and in terms of some of the methodology and the logistics of how we deal with patients, that's some of the things that we've already learned through ePro in traditional ways. So I'm excited to get there. And yeah, we have some pilots that are underway, but I expect that is going to continue to accelerate in our organization.
And Jonathan, how do you feel about the wearables discussion, both from increased usage and from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm part of a working group through the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, where we also have FDA members that are participating, and it's actually focused entirely on this topic, the wearables. And in fact, we're going to be presenting at FDA and following with a white paper, I believe, next month. And so in there, we go into the considerations of, how to evaluate wearables for purposes of, a clinical trial to make sure they're fit for purpose, right? There's differentiating factors such as Ken mentioned. Are you going to utilize just a consumer grade product, a medical grade product, or a formal medical device, or some things are even made specifically for use in clinical trials? I think not all wearables are created equally, so it's really a function of what are your needs for your particular study and what's going to be the most helpful, useful, and efficient approach towards incorporating some of this information into your endpoints, into your trials. So I think overall, passively collecting data is a convenience factor, but I think it's more than just a novelty. I think we can derive a lot of value from it if we carefully take into consideration what options we have as sponsors, and then out of those options, selecting those that make the most sense for our needs. And it can be, again, a combination of different devices. It could even be some sort of compromise where maybe you don't necessarily increase cost, and so you go with a consumer grade or an app that's already integrated into someone's phone, and so it's sort of on the fringe of an exploratory endpoint, but it's kind of a no-brainer because you really don't have any downside to collecting it if it's already there to begin with. And so I think you really have to think through all of these possibilities before making a decision as to whether or not to utilize wearables. But I think from a patient engagement perspective, there is some appeal from that aspect. And we all, we talk about the gamification. There's always that drive to, ooh, I want to, see how well I did. How many steps did I take today? How many, calories did I consume? And so I think that can also play into patient compliance and being, active participants in the clinical trials as well. So I think there's a multitude of benefits that can be derived from integrating wearables into our clinical trials.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Donna, I think you had an example of devices that are cleared from FDA and how they're being used, the wearables.
Yeah, so I think the other gentlemen have already mentioned things that are consumer devices rather than FDA-approved medical devices, and those are things that I think we're seeing on our side, both options. One of them that's an FDA device that I think is interesting is an EKG monitor that actually requires you to put your fingertips on these pads, and it can be attached to the back of a phone. It can be actually in a watch band. So these are really cool things. There are other ones that are in place right now to detect seizures for epilepsy patients, which I think is also really cool. It's another medical device cleared by the FDA that the patient wears all the time. It connects to an app and alerts parents, especially for their children when they're about to be seizing or seizing. I think all of these types of devices can be integrated with eCOA solutions, especially cloud solutions. And then to me, it becomes very interesting to compare patients' subjective responses from the PROs that we're collecting to the objective data that's being provided by the wearable device, and being able to then probably come to conclusions that maybe we didn't even expect to see. That is an exciting, I think, future eventuality of the combination of wearables and in eCOA data.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we're at the top of the hour, and we did not get to our site burden discussion, and I know that we all have a lot of information about that. So what I think I'm going to do offline, guys, is we'll talk about this, and then I'll write it up for an article that I can post online. So I hope that'll be helpful for everyone about that discussion. And then, what did I want to say? We're going to wrap up. I hope our audience found this discussion valuable and informative, and I want to thank you, Donna and Ken and Jonathan. Thank you so much for this panel. I've had a lot of fun working with you guys over the past couple months doing this, preparing for it. So I'm going to now hand the webinar over to Nima.
Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. If your question wasn't attended to during the Q&A session, the team from Y Prime will do their best to follow up with you after the webinar. You can also reach out to our speakers directly by using the email address displayed on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. I just sent you a link in the chat box where you can share the webinar with your colleagues on LinkedIn. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers by sending a quick message through the chat panel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day.